A Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The worst part about public rejection wasn't the humiliation itself, though that cut deep enough to leave scars that Sarah Frost knew would never fully heal. But rather, it was the way everyone looked at you afterward. Their eyes full of pity mixed with relief that it wasn't them standing in the center of the ceremony circle, wearing a borrowed white dress and a heart that was shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Sarah stood perfectly still in the River Bend Pack's ceremonial grounds, her long silver hair that fell past her waist catching the last rays of sunset and turning it into liquid moonlight. Though she knew from years of cruel comments that her pack members thought her hair was just a pale imitation of true silver wolves, a genetic quirk that marked her as different in all the wrong ways, rather than special in any meaningful sense. Her violet-gray eyes, usually downcast to avoid drawing attention, were fixed on Dylan Marsh as he circled her slowly, like a predator evaluating prey. His expression one of barely concealed disgust as he examined every inch of her appearance with the critical assessment of someone inspecting livestock at market and finding the goods severely wanting. Dylan was a mid-ranking beta, nothing spectacular in terms of power or influence within the pack hierarchy, but he was handsome enough with his dark hair and strong build, and more importantly, he came from a respectable family with connections and status, which was more than anyone could say about Sarah, the orphaned daughter of dead rogues who'd been taken in by the pack out of obligation to Moon Goddess Law, rather than any genuine desire to care for a grieving 8-year-old child who'd just watched her parents get torn apart by a rival rogue group. The pack alpha, Marcus Thorne, had assigned them as a match 3 months ago, pairing Dylan with Sarah because no one else had volunteered to take the poor Omega girl who'd spent the last 16 years working as a servant in the Omega house, cooking and cleaning and doing laundry for higher-ranking wolves, who barely acknowledged her existence beyond barking orders and complaining when their meals weren't seasoned exactly to their preferences. Sarah had known from the moment Alpha Marcus announced the pairing that Dylan wasn't happy about it, had seen the way his jaw clenched and his hands fisted at his sides, had heard him arguing with the Alpha afterward about being forced to mate with someone so far beneath his station, but she'd hoped, foolishly and desperately, that maybe once they spent time together during the traditional courting period, he might see something in her worth keeping, some quality that would make her acceptable, if not desirable. She'd been wrong, catastrophically and publicly wrong, and now the entire pack was gathered to witness her humiliation as Dylan stopped his circling to stand directly in front of her, his lips curled in an expression of contempt that made Sarah's stomach twist with nausea and her hands tremble where they were clasped in front of her simple white dress. The only nice garment she owned, and even that was borrowed from the Omega House's communal closet because she'd never had money or reason to own anything beautiful. Dylan looked past her toward Alpha Marcus, who sat on the ceremonial throne with the pack elders flanking him on either side, all of them watching with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed amusement, as if Sarah's fate was nothing more than evening entertainment to break up the monotony of their comfortable lives. Dylan's voice carried across the ceremonial grounds with cruel clarity, pitched loud enough that every single pack member could hear every devastating word, and Sarah felt each syllable land like a physical blow against her already fragile sense of self-worth that had been systematically destroyed over 16 years of being treated as less than, as other, as fundamentally unworthy of love or respect or basic human dignity. "I refuse this match," Dylan declared, his tone leaving no room for doubt or negotiation, and Sarah felt something inside her chest crack wide open, though she kept her expression carefully blank because showing weakness in front of the pack would only make things worse, would only confirm what they already believed about her being too soft and too broken to deserve a place among them. Dylan continued speaking, his words gaining momentum and cruelty as he warmed to his subject, clearly enjoying the power he held in this moment to destroy what little remained of Sarah's dignity and hope for a future that didn't involve dying alone and unmated in some forgotten corner of the territory. "Look at her," he said, gesturing at Sarah with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if she were an object rather than a person standing right there listening to every word. "She's poor. She has nothing to her name except the dress she borrowed for this ceremony. She's plain, despite that silver hair she probably thinks makes her special, when really it just makes her look like a ghost or a corpse. Something unnatural and unsettling rather than beautiful or desirable." He was just getting started, and Sarah could see in his eyes that he intended to make this rejection as thorough and devastating as possible, wanted to ensure that she understood exactly how far beneath him she was, how lucky she should have felt that he'd even considered the match for the 3 months of their mandated courtship period, during which he'd made every excuse to avoid spending time with her, and had never once looked at her with anything approaching genuine interest or affection. "She's worked as a servant her entire life," Dylan continued, his voice dripping with disdain that made several pack members nod in agreement, as if her history of service and hard work was something shameful rather than evidence of her willingness to contribute and help others, cooking and cleaning for her betters because that's all she's capable of, that's all she's worth, and I will not bind myself to someone so far beneath my station, someone who brings nothing to a mating except poverty and plainness and a bloodline so tainted by rogue heritage that any pups we might have would be looked down upon and pitied for having such inferior maternal genetics." The words kept coming, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage, and Sarah found herself disconnecting from her body in the way she'd learned to do during the worst moments of her life, letting her consciousness float somewhere above the scene so she could observe her own destruction with a sort of detached numbness that was preferable to feeling the full weight of this public evisceration of her character and worth. Dylan's voice rose as he reached his conclusion, wanting to ensure that even the pack members standing at the very back of the gathered crowd could hear his final condemnation of the girl who dared to hope that someone might see value in her, despite all evidence to the contrary, accumulated over 16 years of rejection and isolation, and being treated as fundamentally less than everyone around her. "I want an Omega with status, with a proper family that can provide connections and alliances, with beauty that other packs will envy, and wealth that will improve my own standing within our hierarchy," he declared, and then he looked directly at Sarah for the first time during his entire speech, his dark eyes cold and merciless as he delivered his final blow with precision designed to break whatever fragile pieces of her heart were still intact. "This one offers nothing. She is nothing. She has always been nothing, and I refuse to waste my one chance at a proper mate bond on someone so thoroughly and completely worthless." The silence that followed his declaration was absolute and suffocating, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pine trees surrounding the ceremonial grounds and the distant cry of a hawk hunting in the twilight. And Sarah stood frozen in that silence, feeling like she was drowning in it, like the air had become too thick to breathe, and her lungs were forgetting how to function properly under the weight of so much concentrated rejection and public humiliation. She didn't cry. Had learned years ago that crying only made things worse, because it gave people ammunition to call her weak and oversensitive. So she kept her face carefully neutral and her eyes dry, even as something fundamental inside her shattered into pieces so small she knew she'd never be able to put them back together again. Alpha Marcus Thorne rose from his ceremonial throne, his expression one of resigned acceptance rather than any real sympathy for the girl whose life he was about to make infinitely worse. And his voice carried the weight of official judgment as he spoke the words that would seal Sarah's fate and cast her out into a world that had never wanted her in the first place. The rejection is witnessed and accepted by the River Bend Pack, Alpha Marcus intoned, his formal words making Dylan's cruel speech into pack law that couldn't be challenged or appealed, and several pack members actually applauded as if they were celebrating her exile rather than mourning the loss of one of their own, even if that one had never been fully accepted or valued during her 16 years of service and sacrifice. The Alpha's next words came without hesitation or consideration for the fact that night was falling and the temperature was dropping, and Sarah had nowhere to go and no resources to survive on her own in the wilderness that surrounded their territory on all sides. "Sarah Frost, you have until dawn to leave River Bend territory," he declared, and Sarah's mind went blank with shock because she'd expected to be rejected, but hadn't anticipated being banished immediately, had thought maybe she'd be allowed to stay and continue working in the Omega House, relegated back to her servant status, but at least alive and sheltered. "If you are found within our borders after sunrise, you will be executed for trespassing on pack lands without permission or protection from an Alpha," he continued, and there was no mercy in his voice, no acknowledgement that he was essentially sentencing her to death by exposure, because everyone knew that lone Omegas didn't survive long in the wilderness, didn't have the strength or skills to hunt and fight and defend themselves against rogues and wild animals and the harsh elements of late autumn sliding into early winter. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, to ask for supplies, or at least a chance to gather her few belongings from the Omega House, but Alpha Marcus held up a hand to silence her before she could form words, his expression making it clear that the judgment was final, and any appeals would be met with immediate violence rather than consideration or compassion. The pack members were already dispersing, returning to their warm homes and comfortable lives without a backward glance at the girl they were leaving to die alone in the mountains, and Sarah realized with a clarity that was almost peaceful that no one was going to help her, that no one cared if she lived or died, that she'd spent 16 years hoping for acceptance that was never going to come, and now she was finally being released from that futile hope in the cruelest way possible. She turned without a word, her borrowed white dress already showing dirt at the hem from where she'd been standing in the ceremony circle, and she walked toward the pack border with her head held high and her silver hair streaming behind her like a banner, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken, even though she was shattered so completely that she barely felt like a person anymore. Just a collection of fragmented pieces held together by nothing more than stubborn pride and the fading instinct to keep moving forward. The pack territory ended at a line of ancient pine trees marked with alpha scent to warn away rogues and outsiders, and Sarah crossed that boundary as the last light faded from the sky and the temperature dropped sharply enough that she could see her breath fogging in the air and feel the cold penetrating through her thin dress to settle into her bones. She had no cloak, no supplies, no food or water, nothing but the clothes on her back and the rapidly fading warmth of the day, giving way to what promised to be a freezing night, and she kept walking, simply because stopping would mean accepting death, and some part of her, some stubborn, foolish part that hadn't yet learned that the universe didn't care about her survival, refused to just lie down and give up without at least trying to find shelter or warmth, or some slim chance at making it through until morning. The forest was dense and dark as she moved deeper into the mountains, following no path because there were no paths this far from pack territory, just endless trees and rocks, and the sounds of nocturnal predators beginning their nightly hunts. And Sarah walked for what felt like hours, though it might have been less, because time seemed to lose meaning when you were completely alone in the wilderness with no destination and no hope of rescue. The blizzard hit without warning, which Sarah thought was fitting in a terrible way, because everything in her life seemed to happen without warning. From her parents' deaths, to her rejection, to her banishment. And now, apparently, even the weather was determined to destroy her without giving her time to prepare or find shelter. One moment, she was walking through cold but manageable conditions, and the next, the wind was howling with enough force to nearly knock her off her feet, and snow was falling so thick and fast that she couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The world reduced to a whiteout nightmare of freezing cold and disorientation that made every step a gamble that she might walk straight off a cliff or into a ravine without ever seeing the danger until it was too late. Sarah's thin dress was worse than useless in these conditions, the fabric becoming soaked with snow and clinging to her skin in a way that leached away what little body heat she had left. And her long silver hair that she'd once hoped might make her beautiful to someone was now just dead weight hanging heavy with ice and snow, freezing against her back and shoulders until she could barely feel anything except the all-consuming cold that seemed to be seeping into her very soul. She stumbled over hidden roots and rocks, her bare feet in their thin ceremonial slippers offering no protection against the frozen ground, and she fell more times than she could count, her hands and knees getting scraped and bloodied, though she barely felt the pain through the overwhelming numbness that was spreading through her limbs with the inexorable certainty of approaching death. Her mind started playing tricks on her as hypothermia set in, making her see shapes in the swirling snow that might have been trees or wolves or nothing at all, and she found herself thinking about her parents, wondering if they were waiting for her wherever wolves went when they died, hoping that maybe death wouldn't be so terrible if it meant being reunited with the only people who'd ever loved her unconditionally, before they were ripped away and she was left alone in a world that had no place for orphaned Omega girls with strange silver hair and no pack status. She fell one final time, her legs simply giving out as if they'd decided independently that they were done trying to keep her alive. And Sarah lay in the snow, feeling it pile up around her, and thinking with a sort of distant calm that this was probably how she was going to die, frozen and alone in the mountains, with no one to even know she was gone or care that another unwanted Omega had disappeared into the wilderness, never to be seen again. The cold didn't hurt anymore, which some part of her brain recognized as a very bad sign, and she closed her eyes against the driving snow and let herself drift. Let the numbness take over. Let herself imagine that maybe dying would be peaceful after a life that had been anything but, and she was so close to just giving up entirely when she felt it, a pull so strong and insistent that it cut through the fog of hypothermia and forced her eyes to snap open, even though keeping them closed and letting go would have been so much easier. The pull was like an invisible rope tied around her chest, tugging her insistently to the left, away from the direction she'd been staggering, and toward what looked like nothing but more darkness and more storm. And Sarah couldn't explain why she obeyed that pull, or what instinct made her drag herself to her feet one more time, when every rational thought told her to just stay down and let the cold take her. She stumbled in the direction of that inexplicable tugging sensation, following it blindly because she had nothing left to lose and nowhere else to go. And her healing sense, the one gift she'd inherited from her healer mother, and had spent years developing by treating minor injuries in the pack, even though no one had ever thanked her or acknowledged her skill, suddenly flared to life with an intensity she'd never experienced before, screaming at her that something nearby needed help desperately and urgently. The pull led her to an outcropping of rock that she would have walked right past without seeing it in the whiteout conditions, and behind that rock was a cave entrance, dark and promising shelter from the storm that was actively trying to kill her. And Sarah stumbled toward that entrance with the last reserves of strength she had left, falling through the opening and out of the wind with a gasp of relief that came out more like a sob. She lay on the cave floor for several long moments, just breathing and trying to make her frozen limbs work again. And that's when she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold despite the hypothermia, a low whimpering that spoke of pain and distress, and something large and probably dangerous sharing this shelter with her. Sarah's eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness of the cave, her wolf vision finally kicking in now that she was out of the blinding snow. And what she saw made her heart stop completely for several beats before restarting with a painful lurch that seemed to echo through her entire body. There were 12 wolves in the cave, massive creatures, each one easily twice the size of normal wolves, their pure white fur making them look like ghosts or winter spirits in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance, and they were arranged in a protective circle around something in the center, their bodies forming a barrier that spoke of military training and coordinated defense, even in their obviously injured and weakened state. Sarah should have run, should have backed out of the cave immediately and taken her chances with the blizzard, rather than sharing space with 12 potentially hostile wolves who were clearly elite warriors from some powerful pack. But her healer sense was screaming so loudly now that she couldn't think past the overwhelming need to help, to stop the suffering she could feel radiating from the wolves, like waves of physical pain that made her own body ache in sympathy. She crawled deeper into the cave, moving slowly and carefully to avoid startling the injured wolves, and they all turned their heads to watch her with intelligent eyes that glowed various shades of blue and silver in the darkness, eyes that held too much awareness to be simple animals, and confirmed that these were definitely shifters who'd been caught in the same blizzard that had nearly killed her. The largest wolf, positioned at the very center of the protective circle, had fur that wasn't pure white, but instead held a distinct silver tint that matched Sarah's own hair almost perfectly. And when her eyes met his ice-blue gaze, she felt something in her chest pull tight and warm, despite the cold that was still trying to kill her from the inside out. This wolf, this magnificent creature who was clearly the alpha of this elite group, was barely breathing, his sides moving with shallow movements that spoke of internal injuries and severe hypothermia and magical exhaustion that came from pushing a shifter's body far beyond its normal limits, and Sarah's healing sense told her in clinical detail that he was dying, that all 12 of these wolves were in varying stages of dying from exposure and injuries and the kind of magical drain that came from fighting or running for extended periods without rest. She reached out with trembling hands that were still blue-tinged from her own hypothermia and placed them on the silver-tinted wolf's side, feeling the weak flutter of his heartbeat and the coldness of his fur that should have been warm even in these terrible conditions. And she made a decision in that moment that would change everything, though she didn't know it yet, didn't understand that saving these wolves would save her own life in ways that had nothing to do with finding shelter from a storm. Sarah looked at the 12 pairs of glowing eyes watching her with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope, and she spoke her first words since being rejected and banished, her voice rough from cold and disuse, but steady with a determination that surprised even herself. A refusal to let death claim anyone else, even if she couldn't save herself. "I'm going to help you," she whispered to the wolves, who couldn't answer but seemed to understand, and her hands began to glow with a soft silver light that she'd never seen before. Her healing gift awakening into something more powerful and more terrifying than anything she'd experienced in her 24 years of life. And the silver-tinted wolf's eyes widened as if recognizing something in her that she didn't yet recognize in herself. And the last thing Sarah thought before her healing magic pulled her under into unconsciousness was that maybe, just maybe, the moon goddess hadn't completely abandoned her after all. And maybe dying in this cave trying to save 12 strange wolves was a better ending than freezing alone in the snow after being told she was worthless. And maybe, though she couldn't dare to hope for it, these wolves and this moment were the beginning of something rather than the end. Sarah woke to pain, the kind of deep bone, deep agony that came from pushing a healing gift far beyond its natural limits, and for several confused moments, she couldn't remember where she was or why every cell in her body felt like it was simultaneously burning and freezing. Her head pounding with a rhythm that matched her erratic heartbeat, and her hands cramping so badly that she couldn't make her fingers straighten from the clawed position they'd frozen into during whatever had happened while she was unconscious. The cave came back into focus slowly, her vision swimming and blurring before finally settling on the sight of 12 massive white wolves, all of them still arranged in that protective circle, but now with their heads raised and alert, their glowing eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat, despite the pain that was radiating through every nerve ending she possessed. The silver-tinted wolf, the one who'd been barely breathing when she'd first placed her hands on his side, was now sitting upright in the center of the circle, his ice-blue eyes locked onto her face with an expression that seemed too intelligent and too knowing for an animal who shouldn't be able to understand the depth of what she'd done or the price she'd paid to do it. Her healing sense, usually a gentle awareness that hummed quietly in the background of her consciousness, was now screaming so loudly that she wanted to clamp her hands over her ears, even though she knew the sound was only in her mind. And it was telling her things about her own body that made fear spike sharp and cold through the fog of exhaustion that threatened to pull her back under into unconsciousness. She'd depleted herself dangerously, had reached past the normal reserves of healing energy that every gifted healer learned to carefully manage and protect, had gone deeper into her life force than anyone with proper training would ever recommend, because these wolves had been dying, and she couldn't just sit there and watch it happen, even if they were strangers, even if saving them might kill her, even if the sensible thing would have been to save her own strength and let nature take its course. The silver light that had poured from her hands for what must have been hours, based on how completely drained she felt now, had been unlike anything she'd ever experienced or even heard about in the stories her mother used to tell her before the rogues came and tore her parents apart. And some distant part of Sarah's mind recognized that she'd somehow tapped into something ancient and powerful and possibly forbidden, the kind of healing magic that appeared in legends about the first wolves who'd been blessed directly by the moon goddess herself. The wolves were all watching her with an alertness that confirmed they'd recovered significantly from whatever injuries and magical exhaustion had brought them to the edge of death. And Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction despite her own suffering, because at least she'd accomplished something. At least she'd saved them, even if she hadn't been able to save herself from Dylan's rejection, or the pack's banishment, or the blizzard that was still raging outside the cave entrance with a fury that suggested it had no intention of stopping anytime soon. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it when the cave tilted sideways and her stomach lurched with nausea that came from magical depletion combined with the hypothermia that was still affecting her system. And she would have fallen back and cracked her head on the stone floor if the silver-tinted wolf hadn't moved with startling speed, positioning himself behind her so that when she collapsed backward, she fell against his warm fur instead of cold rock. The unexpected kindness made tears prick at her eyes, which was ridiculous because she'd cried more in the last 12 hours than she had in the previous 16 years combined. But apparently her emotional walls had been thoroughly demolished by rejection and banishment and nearly dying in a blizzard. And now she couldn't seem to stop the tears from sliding down her cheeks, even though she knew crying was pointless and wouldn't change anything about her situation. The wolf made a soft sound that might have been comfort or concern, and Sarah found herself leaning back against his solid warmth, too exhausted and too broken to maintain the careful distance she usually kept between herself and everyone else, and her voice came out rough and barely above a whisper when she finally managed to speak past the tightness in her throat. "I'm sorry I couldn't do more," she said, not sure why she was apologizing to wolves who couldn't understand her words, but feeling the need to explain herself anyway, to justify why she'd only managed to stabilize them rather than completely healing every injury and erasing every trace of the trauma they'd experienced. "I've never done anything like that before. Didn't know I could do anything like that. And I think I might have permanently damaged something inside myself by pushing so hard. But you were all dying, and I couldn't just let that happen. Couldn't walk away, even though it would have been safer and smarter to save my own energy for my own survival." The words kept spilling out in a stream of consciousness ramble that she couldn't seem to stop, her exhaustion and pain stripping away the careful filters she'd spent years building to protect herself from revealing too much vulnerability to anyone who might use it against her. "I was rejected tonight," she continued, her voice breaking on the word rejected as if speaking it aloud made it more real somehow, made it impossible to pretend that maybe it had all been a terrible nightmare from which she might wake up and find herself back in her small cot in the Omega house preparing for another day of cooking and cleaning and being invisible to everyone around her. Dylan Marsh, a beta from my pack, stood in front of everyone and told them I was worthless, that my silver hair was just a cheap imitation of real silver wolves, that I brought nothing to a potential mating except poverty and plainness and inferior genetics from my rogue parents, who died when I was 8 years old, and left me alone in a world that never wanted me in the first place. The silver-tinted wolf shifted slightly behind her, and Sarah could have sworn she felt something like anger radiating from him at her words, though that was probably just her imagination projecting human emotions onto an animal who had no reason to care about the personal tragedies of a stranger who'd happened to find their cave during a storm. She found herself telling them everything, the whole pathetic story of her life spilling out in the darkness of the cave, while the blizzard raged outside, and the 12 wolves listened with an attention that felt almost like being truly heard for the first time in her life. And maybe it was easier to confess everything to animals who couldn't judge her or spread gossip about her failures because they couldn't speak. Or maybe she'd just been alone for so long that even the presence of non-speaking creatures was enough to make her desperate for connection. "I spent 16 years in the River Bend Pack, trying to make myself useful enough that they'd keep me, that they'd see value in me beyond just the labor I could provide. And I thought maybe if I worked hard enough and stayed quiet enough and never asked for anything, someone would eventually look at me and think I was worth something." Her laugh came out bitter and broken, nothing like the musical sound that laughter was supposed to be. and she wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, even though they just kept coming, no matter how many times she tried to stop them. But Dylan looked at me tonight like I was trash, like I was something dirty that he needed to distance himself from before I contaminated him with my unworthiness, and the Pack Alpha banished me immediately, gave me until dawn to leave the territory or face execution. And I walked into the mountains with nothing because I had nowhere else to go, and no one who cared whether I lived or died. The silver-tinted wolf made another soft sound and pressed closer against her back, and Sarah found the contact more comforting than she wanted to admit, found herself relaxing into the warmth he provided, even though she knew she shouldn't get attached to these wolves, because as soon as the storm cleared, they'd leave and she'd be alone again. And that thought made fresh tears spill over, because apparently she hadn't learned her lesson about hoping for things that could never be hers. "I was going to die out there in the snow," she whispered, her voice so quiet now that she wasn't sure the wolves could even hear her over the howling wind outside the cave. "I fell down, and I couldn't get back up, and the cold didn't hurt anymore, which I know means you're close to the end. And I actually thought maybe it would be peaceful to just let go, to stop fighting a world that had made it abundantly clear that there was no place in it for someone like me." She paused, gathering her thoughts through the fog of exhaustion, and then continued with something that might have been wonder or confusion coloring her tone. "But then I felt this pull, this instinct that was so strong I couldn't ignore it even though I was barely conscious. And it led me here to this cave where you were all dying. And my healing sense went crazy, telling me that you needed help. And I couldn't just walk away, because apparently, even when I'm trying to let myself die, I still can't stand by and watch others suffer without trying to do something about it." She turned slightly so she could see the silver-tinted wolf's face, meeting those remarkable ice-blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. And she felt that strange pulling sensation again in her chest, that warmth that had nothing to do with physical temperature and everything to do with something she didn't understand, but could feel building between them like an invisible thread being woven with each passing moment. "I don't know who you are or why you were caught in this storm, or what brought 12 elite warriors to this particular mountain on this particular night," she said, because it was obvious even to her inexperienced eyes that these weren't ordinary wolves, but trained soldiers who served some powerful pack. "But I'm glad I found you. Glad I was able to help, even if it means I've probably shortened my own life by however many years it takes to recover from depleting my healing gift this badly, because at least I did something that mattered. At least my last act before dying in this cave will be saving others, instead of just being rejected and discarded like I've been my entire life." The wolf's eyes seemed to intensify at her words, and she could have sworn she saw something like determination, or perhaps decision, flash across his face before he threw his head back and let out a howl that made the cave walls vibrate and made Sarah's heart jump into her throat with startled fear. The other 11 wolves immediately joined in, their combined voices creating a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying, and Sarah didn't understand what was happening or what the howling meant. But she could feel power building in the cave, could sense magic gathering in the air around them with an intensity that made her skin prickle and her healing sense flare even brighter, despite how depleted she was. The silver-tinted wolf's body began to shimmer and shift, and Sarah scrambled backward in alarm because she'd seen wolves shift before, but never with this much power. Never with this much visible magic crackling in the air like lightning about to strike. And then suddenly, where the wolf had been standing, there was a man. The most magnificent man Sarah had ever seen in her life. Tall and powerfully built with shoulder-length silver hair, that matched her own almost exactly, and ice blue eyes that held the same intensity they'd had in his wolf form. He was completely naked, which should have embarrassed her, but she was too shocked to look away, too stunned by the transformation and by the sheer presence he radiated, even while clearly still recovering from near death. And when he spoke, his voice was deep and rough from disuse, but carried an authority that made it clear this was someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You saved us," he said, and it wasn't a question but a statement of fact, and he took a step toward her while Sarah's mind tried to process what was happening, and failed completely because nothing in her life had prepared her for this moment, or for the way her entire body seemed to come alive at the sound of his voice. "You gave everything you had, pushed yourself to the brink of death, to save 12 strange wolves you'd never met and had no obligation to help." He moved closer, and Sarah found herself frozen in place, unable to back away or run or do anything except stare at this silver-haired stranger who'd been a dying wolf just moments ago, and was now a man who looked at her with an intensity that made her feel like she was being seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. The other 11 wolves were shifting now too, transforming into equally impressive men who immediately dropped to one knee in a gesture of respect that confused Sarah even more, because why would elite warriors show deference to a rejected Omega who had nothing and was nothing? And one of them spoke in a voice filled with reverence that made her even more uncomfortable. "Luna," the man said, his head bowed so she couldn't see his face clearly in the dim light. "We owe you our lives and our loyalty, and the Northern Crown Pack will be honored to call you our queen." Luna, the word echoed in Sarah's mind like a bell tolling, and queen, those titles that couldn't possibly be meant for her. And she looked from the kneeling warriors back to the silver-haired man who was still watching her, with those ice-blue eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire, despite the cold that surrounded them. "I don't understand," she managed to say, her voice coming out weak and confused, and she wrapped her arms around herself in a futile attempt to stop the shaking that had started in her limbs and was spreading through her entire body as shock and exhaustion and magical depletion all combined to make her feel like she might simply fall apart into pieces that could never be reassembled. "I'm not a Luna. I'm nobody. I'm just Sarah Frost, a rejected Omega who was banished from her pack for being worthless, and I don't know who you are or why your warriors are calling me queen. But there's been some terrible mistake." The silver-haired man took another step closer, closing the distance between them until Sarah could feel the heat radiating from his body and could see the scars that crossed his chest and shoulders, evidence of battles fought and survived. And when he spoke again, his voice was softer but no less commanding. "My name is Theron Silvercrest," he said, and Sarah felt her heart stop completely, because everyone in the werewolf world knew that name. Everyone had heard stories about the young Alpha King who'd taken the throne at 21 after his parents died in a territorial war and had spent 7 years building the Northern Crown Kingdom into the most powerful territory in existence. The Alpha King, who was known as the Ice King because of his legendary coldness and his refusal to take a mate, despite being presented with 47 potential matches over the years. "I'm the Alpha King of the Northern Crown," he continued, confirming what Sarah's shocked mind had already started to suspect. "And you, Sarah Frost, are my mate, my true mate blessed by the moon goddess herself, and I felt the bond snap into place the moment you put your hands on me and poured your life force into saving mine, without asking for anything in return, or even knowing who I was." Sarah's legs gave out completely, her body simply refusing to hold her upright anymore under the weight of too many revelations and too much exhaustion. and Theron caught her before she hit the ground, lifting her into his arms with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his reputation for coldness and carrying her over to where his cloak lay discarded near the cave wall. He wrapped her in the heavy fur-lined fabric that was still warm from his body heat, and Sarah found herself pressed against his bare chest, while her mind spun in circles, trying to make sense of what he'd just told her, trying to reconcile the idea that she, the rejected and banished Omega, who'd been told she was worthless just hours ago, was apparently the true mate of the most powerful alpha in the werewolf world. "This can't be real," she whispered against his chest, her voice muffled by the cloak and by the way her face was pressed into the hollow of his shoulder, and she felt him tense at her words, felt something like hurt flash through the bond that was apparently forming between them, whether she understood it or not. "I was rejected tonight for being plain and poor and worthless, and now you're telling me I'm your mate, that I'm supposed to be a Luna, a queen, and it doesn't make sense, because the moon goddess wouldn't be that cruel, wouldn't let me be destroyed by one pack just to raise me up with another." Theron's arms tightened around her, and when he spoke, his voice held an edge of barely controlled anger that she instinctively knew wasn't directed at her, but at the pack that had treated her so badly, at Dylan who'd rejected her so cruelly, at a world that had convinced her she was worthless when she was actually the most precious thing he'd ever found. "The male who rejected you was a fool who couldn't recognize treasure when it was standing right in front of him," he said, his words vibrating through his chest and into her body, where she was pressed against him. And Sarah felt tears starting again because she couldn't seem to stop crying today. Couldn't seem to maintain the emotional control she'd built up over years of practice. "Your silver hair isn't a cheap imitation. It's a perfect match for mine. It's the sign my mother told me to look for before she died. And your gift for healing isn't something common or ordinary. It's the ancient power of a life weaver, one of the rarest and most valued abilities a wolf can possess." He shifted so he could look down at her face, his ice blue eyes intense and serious as he continued speaking words that Sarah desperately wanted to believe, but couldn't quite let herself accept, because accepting them would mean hoping again, and hope had only ever led to more pain. "I've been searching for you for 7 years, without knowing I was searching," Theron said, his voice dropping to something intimate and vulnerable that didn't match his reputation at all, and Sarah found herself unable to look away from his eyes, even though the intensity of his gaze made her want to hide. "I rejected 47 Omegas because none of them felt right. Because my wolf refused to accept any of them? Because something inside me knew you were out there somewhere, and settling for anyone else would be a betrayal of what we were meant to be." His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away tears that she hadn't realized were still falling, and the contact made that pulling sensation in her chest intensify until it felt like her heart was trying to leap out of her body and merge with his. "I was dying in this cave, my wolf going feral from years of fighting the bond he knew existed but couldn't find. And you appeared like an answer to a prayer I didn't know I was praying, and you saved me not because you knew I was a king, not because you wanted something from me, but because you couldn't stand to watch anyone suffer, even when you were suffering yourself." Sarah wanted to protest, wanted to tell him that he was wrong about her, that she wasn't special or precious, or worthy of being anyone's mate, let alone a king's. But before she could form words, he leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, in a gesture of such tenderness that it stole her breath and made her heart ache with longing for something she'd never let herself want, because wanting things had always led to disappointment. Come with me, Theron said, his words a request rather than a command despite his position and power. And Sarah felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her like a physical thing. Come to my kingdom. Let me show you what your life could be. Let me prove to you that you're not worthless or plain, or any of the cruel things that Fool told you tonight. And if after spending time with me and seeing my pack you still want to leave, I'll let you go, even though it will destroy me. Because I want you to choose this, choose me, choose us, not because fate demands it, but because you want to. The cave fell silent except for the howling wind outside and the sound of their breathing, and Sarah realized that all 12 warriors were still kneeling, still waiting for her response, still treating her with the respect and reverence she'd never experienced in her entire life. And she felt something shift inside her chest, some fundamental piece of her identity cracking open to make room for a possibility she'd never dared to imagine. What if I'm not strong enough to be a Luna? She asked, her voice barely audible, all her fears and insecurities spilling out in that one question. And Theron's response was immediate and fierce, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made her gasp. You walked into a blizzard alone with nothing and survived. You found a cave full of dying wolves and saved them at nearly the cost of your own life. You spent 16 years being treated as less than and never once lost your compassion or your ability to care about others' suffering, and you think you're not strong enough? His voice rose with each word, not in anger, but in passionate conviction that made Sarah wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was seeing something in her that she'd never been able to see in herself. Sarah Frost, you are the strongest person I've ever met, and I've met warriors who fought in hundreds of battles and never shown half the courage you showed tonight when you chose to heal strangers instead of saving yourself. He pulled back slightly so he could look directly into her eyes, and what she saw in his face made her breath catch because it was acceptance. Real, genuine acceptance of who she was, rather than disappointment that she wasn't someone else. I'm scared, Sarah admitted, the words feeling like a confession of weakness, even though Theron's expression softened at hearing them. And she found herself continuing, despite the fear that admitting her feelings would make him realize she wasn't worth the effort after all. I'm scared of hoping again. Scared of believing I could actually be someone's mate. Scared that this is all a dream or a hallucination from hypothermia and I'm actually dying in the snow and imagining this entire conversation. Theron's response was to pull her closer and press a kiss to her forehead that felt like a promise, like a vow, like something sacred being sealed between them. And when he spoke, his words were quiet, but absolutely certain in a way that made her want to believe him despite all her fears and doubts. You're not dreaming, and you're not dying, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you ever again, because you're mine now, my mate, my Luna, my queen, and I protect what's mine with everything I have. The declaration should have scared her, should have felt possessive and overwhelming, but instead it made something warm bloom in her chest, made her feel for the first time in 16 years like maybe she'd finally found somewhere she belonged, someone who wanted her not despite her flaws, but because of everything she was, including the parts she'd been taught to hide. Outside the cave, the blizzard finally began to quiet, the wind dying down to a whisper, and the snow slowing its furious assault, as if even nature itself was recognizing that something significant had shifted, that in this small cave, a rejected Omega and a cold Alpha King had found each other against all odds and were beginning to forge a bond that would change both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine, And Sarah made her choice in that moment, made it despite her fears and her doubts, and all the voices in her head telling her she wasn't good enough. Because Theron was looking at her like she was precious, and the 12 elite warriors were still kneeling in respect, and her heart was telling her that maybe, just maybe, this was what the moon goddess had planned all along when she led Sarah through that blizzard, to this cave where her true mate lay dying. Yes, Sarah whispered, the single word carrying the weight of acceptance and hope and the terrifying decision to trust one more time, despite all the times trust had betrayed her before. And she saw Theron's eyes flash with silver light as his wolf recognized her acceptance, felt the mate bond surge between them like lightning connecting their souls in a way that was both overwhelming and perfect. And she knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again, because she just agreed to follow the Ice King home and become the Luna of the most powerful pack in the werewolf world. And Dylan Marsh and the Riverbend pack and everyone who'd ever called her worthless were about to learn that they'd rejected not a nobody Omega, but the future queen of the Northern Crown. And Sarah couldn't decide whether she was more terrified or exhilarated by what was about to happen when the storm cleared and they left this cave to begin the journey toward her impossible, incredible new life. The journey from the mountain cave to the Northern Crown Palace took 6 days, and Sarah spent every moment of those days trying to convince herself that this wasn't all an elaborate dream from which she'd wake up back in the Omega house, cooking breakfast for wolves who looked through her as if she were invisible. But the reality of Theron's presence beside her made that fear impossible to maintain, because he was so solidly real, so attentive to her needs and comfort, so different from the cold Ice King reputation that preceded him, that she wondered if perhaps the stories had gotten him wrong, or if maybe she was seeing a side of him that he kept hidden from the rest of the world. He'd given her his cloak to wear over the thin ceremonial dress that had nearly gotten her killed, had insisted she ride on his back in wolf form when her feet became too blistered and frozen to walk anymore, had stopped every few hours to make sure she ate and drank and rested, despite the fact that his elite guard was clearly anxious to return home and report to their kingdom that their king had survived and was bringing home the Luna they'd all been waiting for, without knowing they were waiting. Captain Ash, the second in command who'd been the first to call her Luna in the cave, had taken it upon himself to explain things to Sarah during their rest stops, filling in the gaps of information that her exhausted and overwhelmed mind struggled to process about pack politics and royal protocol, and what would be expected of her as Theron's mate. "Our king has been alone too long," Ash told her one evening as they sat around a campfire, while Theron was off hunting with 3 of the guards to provide fresh meat for dinner, and his voice held a warmth that suggested he genuinely cared about his alpha's well-being rather than just following orders out of obligation. He took the throne so young after losing both his parents in that territorial war, and he threw himself into building the kingdom's strength and security with such single-minded focus that he forgot how to be anything except a ruler, forgot how to laugh or relax or connect with anyone on a personal level, and his wolf started going feral from the isolation and the constant pressure of leadership without a mate to balance him. Ash looked at Sarah with an expression that might have been gratitude or relief, or perhaps both combined into something that made her uncomfortable because she still couldn't quite believe that she'd done anything worthy of such regard. "When you healed him in that cave, when you poured your life force into him without asking who he was or what you'd get in return, you didn't just save his physical body. You saved his wolf from going completely feral and potentially destroying everything he'd built. And more than that, you gave him something he's been missing for 7 years, a reason to be something more than just a king." The words made Sarah's chest tight with emotion she didn't know how to name, and she found herself asking the question that had been haunting her since Theron first claimed she was his mate, and explained about the bond that supposedly connected them in ways she still didn't fully understand. "What if I'm not what he needs?" she asked Ash quietly, her voice barely carrying over the crackling of the fire, and she wrapped Theron's cloak tighter around herself, as if the physical warmth could somehow protect her from the vulnerability of admitting her deepest fear. "What if once we get to his kingdom, and he sees me among all the other wolves who are probably beautiful and accomplished and everything I'm not, he realizes he made a mistake in claiming me as his mate?" Ash's response was immediate and firm, his tone leaving no room for doubt, even though Sarah's mind immediately tried to find ways to doubt anyway, because doubt had been her constant companion for 16 years, and old habits were harder to break than bones. "The mate bond doesn't make mistakes," he said, his dark eyes serious as they met hers across the fire. "The moon goddess chose you specifically for our king, marked you with silver hair that matches his own, so he'd recognize you when he finally found you, and gave you the gift of life weaving so you'd have the power to heal not just his body, but his soul. And trust me when I say that Theron Silvercrest doesn't claim things lightly, doesn't make declarations he doesn't mean, and if he says you're his mate and his Luna, then that's exactly what you are, regardless of what doubts you carry about your own worthiness." When Theron returned from the hunt with a deer slung over his broad shoulders, and his silver hair windblown, and his ice-blue eyes immediately seeking her out among the group gathered around the fire, Sarah felt that now familiar pull in her chest intensify, felt the mate bond that she was slowly learning to recognize humming with contentment at his proximity. And she understood with a clarity that was almost painful that Ash was right, that whatever this was between her and Theron wasn't something that could be dismissed or doubted away, no matter how hard her fear-trained mind tried to convince her otherwise. The palace, when they finally arrived on the 6th day of traveling, was more magnificent than anything Sarah had imagined in her wildest dreams. A massive structure of white stone and crystalline ice that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight and sprawled across the valley like something out of ancient legends about the moon goddess's own dwelling place. Pack members stopped what they were doing to stare as Theron led their small group through the gates, and Sarah heard the whispers following them like an audible wave. Comments about her silver hair and her simple clothing, and the way their notoriously cold king kept one hand on her lower back, as if he couldn't bear to not be touching her. And she felt herself shrinking under the weight of so much attention, until Theron leaned down to murmur in her ear, with a voice that was meant only for her. "They're staring because you're beautiful, and because you match me in a way no one has ever seen before, not because there's anything wrong with you. So hold your head up and let them see the Luna who saved their king's life and is about to save this entire kingdom from the coldness that's been slowly freezing it from the inside out." His words gave her the strength to straighten her spine and meet the curious gazes around them with something approaching confidence, and she saw the exact moment when the pack members' expressions shifted from curiosity to acceptance, from judgment to welcome, as if Theron's obvious regard for her had given them permission to see her value instead of her poverty and her outsider status. Elder Sage, the head healer who was apparently older than most of the trees in the surrounding forest and had forgotten more about healing magic than Sarah had ever learned, took one look at her and declared that she needed 3 days of bed rest and constant feeding to recover from the magical depletion she'd suffered, saving Theron and his guards. And Sarah found herself installed in the most beautiful room she'd ever seen. The former Luna's chambers that overlooked the palace gardens and had a bathroom larger than the entire Omega house where she'd lived for 16 years. The 3 days of rest turned into 2 weeks of careful recovery and gradual integration into palace life. And Sarah spent that time learning what it meant to be valued rather than merely tolerated, to be served rather than always serving others, to have people actually care about her opinions and ask for her input instead of just barking orders and expecting immediate obedience. Theron visited her every day, sometimes multiple times, bringing her rare healing herbs he'd sent scouts to gather from distant territories, sitting with her while she ate to make sure she was actually consuming enough food to regain her strength, reading to her from ancient texts about life weavers and their sacred role in wolf society, and always looking at her like she was precious, like she was exactly what he'd been searching for, even when he didn't know he was searching. Elder Sage became her mentor and her friend, teaching her how to properly channel her life-weaving gift without depleting herself dangerously, explaining the history of the Northern Crown Pack and Theron's years of lonely rule, gently pushing Sarah to accept that she deserved the happiness and respect she was being offered instead of waiting for it to be snatched away. It was during the third week of her residence at the palace that Dylan Marsh appeared, and Sarah felt her hard-won confidence shatter the moment she saw him being escorted into the throne room, where she'd been sitting beside Theron, discussing plans for expanding the palace healing ward to accommodate the growing number of wolves who'd heard about the new Luna's gift and were traveling from distant packs seeking her help. Dylan looked smaller than she remembered, less imposing, his handsome face now seeming merely average compared to Theron's striking features. And when his eyes met hers, she saw the moment of shock and disbelief, and then desperate calculation flash across his expression as he realized exactly who she'd become in the weeks since he'd so cruelly rejected her. Theron's hand found hers on the arm of her throne, his fingers threading through hers in a gesture of support and possession that made Dylan's eyes narrow with what looked like jealousy, and Sarah found herself sitting straighter, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed as she prepared to face the man who'd called her worthless and sparked the chain of events that had led her to this impossible new life. "Your Majesty," Dylan said, his voice carefully respectful as he addressed Theron, though his eyes kept sliding back to Sarah as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "I come on behalf of the Riverbend Pack to petition for trading rights and to offer apologies for any offense we may have caused to your Luna." The word Luna came out strangled, as if Dylan was choking on it, and Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction that she immediately felt guilty about because she'd never been the type to take pleasure in others' discomfort. But apparently becoming a queen had awakened some petty part of her that enjoyed watching the man who destroyed her publicly squirm with regret. Theron's voice when he spoke was colder than Sarah had ever heard it, colder than the blizzard that had nearly killed them both, and she felt the temperature in the throne room actually drop several degrees as his power manifested in response to his anger. "You rejected my mate, called her worthless and plain, cast her out into a blizzard to die, and now you dare to come to my kingdom asking for trading rights and offering hollow apologies?" Each word was precisely articulated and sharp enough to cut, and Sarah watched Dylan's face pale as he realized the depth of his mistake and the danger he was now in standing before a furious Alpha King who had every right and reason to have him executed for the crime of harming his Luna. Dylan fell to his knees, his carefully maintained pride crumbling in the face of Theron's wrath, and his next words came out in a desperate rush that might have moved Sarah once, but now just sounded pathetic and self-serving. "I didn't know, Your Majesty. I swear I didn't know she was special, didn't know she had the Lifeweaver gift, or that she was destined for greatness. If I'd known, I never would have rejected her, never would have said those cruel things, and I'm begging you to please reconsider, to give me a chance to make things right, to allow me to properly court her now that I understand her true value." The words hung in the air for a long moment, and Sarah felt Theron's fury building beside her like a storm about to break. But before he could unleash the full force of his rage on Dylan's presumptuous head, Sarah found herself standing, found her voice emerging strong and clear and absolutely certain in a way it had never been before. She'd walked through a blizzard and saved a dying king and discovered that she was worth so much more than anyone had ever told her. "I was special when you rejected me," Sarah said, her voice carrying through the throne room with an authority that surprised even herself, and she saw Dylan's eyes widen as she spoke, as the rejected Omega he'd dismissed transformed before his eyes into the powerful Luna she was becoming. "I was special when I was cooking and cleaning in the Omega house, when I was healing minor injuries without thanks or acknowledgement, when I was standing in that ceremony circle listening to you tell the entire pack that I was worthless. I was always special. I always had value. I always mattered. But you were too blind and too focused on status and appearances to see it." She descended the steps from her throne, Theron moving with her like a shadow, his presence at her back giving her strength even though she no longer needed him to fight her battles, because she was learning to fight them herself. "You didn't reject me because I wasn't good enough, Dylan Marsh. You rejected me because you weren't good enough, because you valued surface qualities over substance, because you were too weak to see past your pack's prejudices and too cowardly to claim a mate who would have given you everything if you just treated her with basic respect and kindness." Dylan was openly crying now, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of what he'd lost hit him with devastating clarity. And Sarah felt nothing, not satisfaction or vindication or even pity, just a sort of distant acknowledgement that this man had once had the power to hurt her. But that power was gone now, dissolved in the forge of her transformation from rejected Omega to cherished Luna. "I don't forgive you," she continued, her voice gentler now but no less firm. "Not because I hate you or wish you harm, but because I don't need your validation anymore, don't need you to admit you were wrong or apologize or try to make amends for the damage you did, because that damage led me exactly where I needed to be. Led me to wolves who were dying in a cave and needed my gift. Led me to a mate who sees my worth without needing to be convinced of it. Led me to a kingdom and a purpose and a life I never could have imagined if you hadn't rejected me that night and set me on the path that brought me here." She turned back to Theron, dismissing Dylan as completely as he'd once dismissed her, and she saw the pride and love shining in her mate's ice-blue eyes as he pulled her close and pressed a kiss to her forehead that sealed her declaration and made it clear to everyone watching that Sarah Silvercrest, Luna of the Northern Crown, was done letting her past define her future. "The Riverbend Pack's petition for trading rights is denied," Theron declared, his voice ringing with finality. "And Dylan Marsh is hereby banished from Northern Crown territory, with instructions never to return on pain of death. And word will be sent to every pack in our alliance network about his treatment of my Luna, so that his rejection and cruelty will follow him wherever he goes." The elite guards moved forward to escort a still weeping Dylan from the throne room, and Sarah watched him go with a sense of closure settling over her like a warm cloak, a feeling that this chapter of her life was finally, truly closed, and she was free to write new chapters that didn't include the pain and rejection that had defined her first 24 years. The weeks that followed Dylan's banishment and departure were filled with preparations for the official mating ceremony that would cement Sarah's position as Luna and complete the mate bond that had been building between her and Theron since that first moment in the cave when she'd placed her glowing hands on his dying wolf and chosen to save him without knowing who he was or what saving him would cost her. The ceremony was held under the full moon, exactly 2 months after Sarah had stumbled into that cave during the blizzard, and every pack in the Alliance network sent representatives to witness the Ice King finally claim his mate after 7 years of cold isolation. And Sarah wore a dress of silver silk and white fur that Elder Sage had spent weeks creating specifically for this moment. And her long silver hair was adorned with winter flowers and crystals that caught the moonlight and made her look like a living embodiment of the moon goddess herself. Theron stood waiting for her at the altar, dressed in formal royal attire that emphasized his powerful build and his natural authority. But his ice-blue eyes were soft with emotion as he watched her approach. And Sarah knew with absolute certainty that this was right, that despite all the pain and rejection and suffering she'd endured to get here, this moment made it all worthwhile because she was choosing love over fear and hope over despair, and a future with this magnificent male who'd somehow seen past all her defenses to the person she was capable of becoming. The vows they exchanged were personal and raw and honest. Theron speaking about 7 years of searching without knowing what he was, searching for and finding salvation in a dying Omega's selfless gift. Sarah confessing her fears and doubts, and the way he'd taught her to see herself as valuable and worthy of love, both of them crying unashamedly as they spoke their promises to each other in front of thousands of witnesses who would carry the story of the Ice King's thaw back to their home packs. When Theron marked her neck with his teeth, claiming her as his mate and Luna before the moon goddess, and all assembled, Sarah felt the bond explode between them with such intensity that silver light poured from both their bodies and washed over the entire gathering. Her Life Weaver gift responding to the completion of their bond by sharing a wave of healing and peace and joy that left every wolf present feeling blessed and renewed. The kingdom celebrated for 3 days straight, and Sarah spent those days learning what it meant to be truly happy, to be valued and cherished and celebrated instead of merely tolerated, to have a mate who looked at her like she hung the moon and stars, and a pack that welcomed her, not despite her past, but because her past had made her exactly the Luna they needed. 3 years later, Sarah stood in the palace healing ward, watching a young Omega girl with silver-streaked hair cry over her recent rejection and banishment from a neighboring pack, and she felt that familiar pull of recognition, that understanding of exactly what this girl was feeling, because she'd stood in those same shoes not so long ago, and knew intimately what it was like to believe you were worthless and unwanted. She took the girl's trembling hands in her own and waited until frightened eyes met hers before speaking words she wished someone had spoken to her before she'd had to nearly die to learn their truth. "I know your pain," Sarah said softly, her Luna authority making the words carry weight beyond their simple delivery. "Because 3 years ago, I was standing exactly where you're standing now. Rejected by a male who called me worthless, banished by a pack that saw me as nothing more than a servant, walking into a blizzard with no hope and no future, believing that maybe dying alone in the cold was better than continuing to live in a world that had made it abundantly clear there was no place in it for someone like me." The girl's eyes widened with shock and disbelief, clearly struggling to reconcile the powerful Luna standing before her with the story of rejection and despair being shared. And Sarah smiled with understanding, because she remembered that same disbelief, that inability to imagine that anything good could come from such complete devastation. "But the moon goddess had other plans," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she pulled the girl to her feet and led her to the window that overlooked the palace gardens, where Theron was playing with their 6-month-old daughter, his silver hair mingling with the baby's matching locks as he lifted her high into the air and made her shriek with delighted laughter. She led me through that blizzard to a cave where 12 wolves were dying, including the Alpha King who would become my mate. And she gave me the strength to save them even though I thought I had nothing left to give. And she showed me that being rejected wasn't my ending, but my beginning. Wasn't proof of my worthlessness, but evidence that I was being saved for something greater than I could imagine. Sarah turned back to the girl and cupped her face gently, seeing her own past reflected in those desperate, hopeless eyes. Your rejection isn't a reflection of your value. It's a reflection of their inability to recognize what they had. And somewhere out there is a pack and a mate who will see you exactly as you are and love you, not despite your perceived flaws, but because of everything you are. And I promise you that if you can just hold on through this darkness, if you can just keep walking even when you want to give up, the moon goddess will lead you exactly where you need to be. Just like she led me here to this impossible, beautiful life I never dared to dream of having. The girl stayed at the palace, joining dozens of other wolves Sarah had rescued from various forms of rejection and trauma. All of them healing under the care of the Luna who understood their pain because she'd lived it. And Sarah watched each one slowly transform from broken to whole, from lost to found, from certain they were worthless to understanding they were precious. Theron found her that evening on their private balcony overlooking the kingdom, and he wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder, and his silver hair falling forward to mingle with hers in the way that had become their signature as the matched rulers of the Northern Crown. "You saved another one today," he murmured against her ear, his voice warm with pride and love. "How many lost wolves are you going to collect before you're satisfied?" Sarah leaned back against his solid warmth and smiled as she watched the sun set over their kingdom, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to promise endless tomorrows filled with possibility. "All of them," she answered simply, because if her suffering had taught her anything, it was that no one deserved to feel worthless or unwanted, and if she could use her story to give hope to even one person who was standing in the darkness where she'd once stood, then every moment of pain she'd endured would have been worth it. "They told me I was nothing," Sarah said quietly, speaking to the wind and the fading light, and the mate whose arms made her feel safer than she'd ever felt in her life. "Told me my silver hair was fake. Told me I brought nothing to a potential mating except poverty and plainness. Told me I was so worthless that dying in a blizzard would be preferable to letting me contaminate their pack with my inferior presence. And I believed them because I'd spent 16 years being shown that I didn't matter, that my existence was at best a burden and at worst a curse to be endured." She turned in Theron's arms so she could look up at his face, at the ice-blue eyes that had never looked at her with anything except love and acceptance and fierce protectiveness. "But you taught me differently, taught me that strength isn't measured by power or status, but by the willingness to give everything to save others, that beauty isn't about perfect features, but about the light that shines from inside when you choose kindness over cruelty. That worth isn't something other people assign to you, but something you carry within yourself, regardless of how they choose to treat you." Theron kissed her then, deep and passionate, and full of promises they'd already kept to each other 1,000 times over. And when they pulled apart, both of them were smiling with the easy contentment of mates who'd found their perfect match against all odds. "The cold Alpha King never wanted a mate," Sarah said, repeating the title she'd heard whispered about Theron before she knew him, before she loved him, before she understood that his coldness had been armor protecting a heart that had been wounded by loss and responsibility, and the crushing weight of leadership without partnership. Until a poor, rejected Omega girl made his wolf go wild by showing him what he'd been missing all along. By healing not just his body, but his soul. By choosing to save him when no one had ever chosen to save her. By being so thoroughly and completely herself that he had no choice but to fall in love with everything she was, including the parts she'd been taught to hide or be ashamed of. Theron pulled her close again, and they stood together on their balcony as darkness fell and the stars came out one by one. Two silver-haired wolves who'd found each other in the middle of a storm and built a kingdom on the foundation of choosing love, even when fear screamed at them to protect themselves. Choosing hope, even when despair seemed more reasonable. Choosing each other every single day, not because fate demanded it, but because they wanted to, and that choice, made freely and repeatedly, was worth more than all the power and status and security in the world. So, if you're standing in the darkness tonight, feeling rejected, feeling worthless, feeling like the world has no place for someone like you, remember this story of a girl with silver hair who was told she was nothing and became a queen. Of a king who was frozen solid until love thawed him back to life. Of two broken souls who found each other and discovered that brokenness can be beautiful when you find someone who loves all your shattered pieces and helps you rebuild them into something even stronger than what you were before. The moon goddess has plans for you that you can't see yet, paths that lead through darkness into light, and your rejection isn't your ending, but your beginning. And somewhere out there is a cave full of dying wolves, waiting for you to stumble in and save them, and in doing so save yourself. And all you have to do is keep walking, keep breathing, keep believing that you matter even when everyone around you insists you don't. Because you do matter, you always have, and the right people will see it when the time comes for them to enter your story and transform your life into something you never dared to dream was possible.